All right, let's dive into a theory that's been absolutely exploding across the internet. It's this idea that our entire history isn't what we've been told, that it's been rewritten. And the proof? Well, it's supposedly buried right under our feet, in our own cities. It's a pretty wild ride, so let's get into it.
You know, it all kicks off with this one simple question, something you might have even wondered about yourself. Have you ever been walking through an old part of town and noticed these gorgeous, grand old buildings, but their first-floor windows and doors are halfway underground? They seem to lead nowhere but straight into the dirt. Well, that little architectural puzzle is the rabbit hole for this entire theory.
So what's the explanation? Well, according to this narrative, the answer is a cataclysmic event they call the Mud Flood. And we're not talking about a local river overflowing its banks. No, this was supposedly a planetary disaster that literally buried the ground floors of a much older, much more advanced civilization that existed right where we're standing. So let's start with that. What's the first piece of this whole puzzle? We're going to look at the architectural evidence that proponents say proves our history books are, well, missing a few really important chapters. And this is where things get really interesting, because the theory takes structures we all know and completely reframes what they were for. Take star forts. The official story says they were for military defense. This theory? It says they were energy capacitors. Those amazing Beaux-Arts buildings from the Gilded Age? Not newly built, but actually ancient structures being dug out of the mud. And the big world's fairs? Get this. They weren't temporary exhibits. They were entire Tartarian cities that had been excavated and put on display, only to be demolished later.
Okay, so if these incredible buildings had a totally different purpose, who on Earth built them? That question takes us right to the heart of this whole thing, a lost global empire that was responsible for all of it.
And that would be the Tartarian Empire. The idea is that this was a worldwide civilization, way more advanced than us, both technologically and spiritually. It supposedly dominated the planet during the time we call the Middle Ages. And what's really interesting is that if you look at old maps from the 16th or 17th centuries, you'll actually see a huge territory called Great Tartaria stretching across Asia. Proponents of the theory see this as proof of this forgotten empire.
And this empire, well, it apparently ran on a completely different kind of technology, based on something called aether, or atmospheric energy. In this view, our grandest cathedrals weren't just places of worship. They were power plants. Their spires and crosses were antennas, pulling energy from the air. Those beautiful rose windows and massive pipe organs, they weren't just for art and music. They were tools for healing with sound and frequency. It completely reframes ancient architecture as functional, advanced tech.
So, what happened? I mean, if there was this incredible high-tech world, where did it go? Well, according to the narrative, it didn't just fade out. It was violently and very deliberately erased from history. The theory lays out this devastating 1-2 punch. First, you have the physical disaster, that's the mud flood, which buried their world and wiped out most of the people. But then, right after that, a new group of elites supposedly took over and launched a coordinated campaign to rewrite history itself, to cover up any evidence that the previous civilization ever existed. They call this the Great Reset. Let's look at a really specific example, Chicago. Okay, so the official history books tell us that back in the 1850s, the entire city was physically lifted up on jack screws to install a modern sewer system. Sounds incredible, right? Well, the Tartarian interpretation says it's not just incredible, it's impossible. They argue that this was actually a cover story for the enormous job of excavating a massive Tartarian city that was buried deep in mud. So, the crucial point here is that this theory completely rewrites our timeline. It says the Tartarian Golden Age, this global civilization, lasted until around the 1500s. Then came the cataclysm. And then, famous historical events like Napoleon's invasion of Moscow are reframed as a war against the last survivors of Tartaria. And even the world wars, they say, were used as an excuse to destroy the last of their amazing architecture.
All right, so you've had a global cataclysm, you've covered up history. What do you do with a planet full of empty cities and farms? How do you repopulate the world? This brings us to one of the most disturbing parts of the theory. 250,000. Just think about that number for a second. That's how many children were relocated across America by a program called the Orphan Trains.
So officially, they were said to be street kids, orphans, children of poor immigrants. But the theory asks a much darker question. How did 250,000 parentless children just suddenly appear, right at the exact moment in history when all these new cities needed a fresh population? It suggests there's something else going on entirely.
The theory lays out this really chilling three-step system for basically creating a new humanity. Step 1, production. Those popular incubator baby exhibits at the world's fairs, the theory claims they weren't just for saving premature babies, they were actually hatcheries creating a new population from scratch. Step 2, distribution. The orphan trains were the logistical network used to ship these children who had no memory of the past out to populate the empty world. And finally, Step 3, incarceration. Those massive castle-like insane asylums that were built everywhere, they were supposedly prisons for any adults who survived the cataclysm and remembered the world before the reset.
So, if this was such a perfect cover-up, if all this history was just erased, why are we even talking about it now? Well, this is where the whole story comes full circle, right into our modern digital age.
According to proponents of the theory, for more than a century, a controlling elite had a total monopoly on history and information. But one thing changed everything: the internet. Suddenly, regular people could access digital archives, old maps, forgotten photos. They could connect the dots for themselves.
And you know what? People are connecting some really fascinating dots. They're pointing to old 19th century photos of cities like London or San Francisco that look eerily empty with no people. They call it the vanilla sky phenomenon. And they're also looking at modern science like LiDAR technology, which is revealing these vast ancient urban networks buried under jungles like the Amazon as proof that there was a global civilization we knew nothing about.
This quote from the source material really just sums up the whole worldview perfectly. It suggests that we are, all of us, living in the ruins of a stolen past, with no idea about our true history or our true potential.
And that's where we'll leave it for this explainer, with one last thought to chew on. Whether you see this as a crazy conspiracy theory or a hidden truth being uncovered, the Tartarian narrative forces you to look at the world a little differently, to look at those old buildings and ask yourself, what if the most incredible stories aren't stories at all? What if they're history that we were simply forced to forget?